Madam Ruth would wake up as soon as it clocked 12 a.m. in the midnight and transform into a large-headed python and head straight into the students' hostel. The moonlight would catch the emerald green of her scales as she slid silently over the sharp stones of the schoolyard. This was Green Spring School, the biggest and most famous boarding school in all of Lagos. From the outside, it looked like a palace for the children of the rich. It had high gates, freshly painted white walls, and beautiful flowers planted along the driveway. But inside, it held a darkness that no one could see during the day. Welcome to African Folktales by Kate. If you're just seeing us for the first time, please like and subscribe for more unique African tales. Madam Ruth was the quietest teacher in the whole school. She was a woman who seemed to be made of shadows. She never raised her voice, even when the classroom was as noisy as an open market in Oshodi. She never used a cane, and she never reported a student to the principal. She walked with her head down, carrying her dusty textbooks to the classroom every morning, her old shoes making a soft tap-tap sound on the tiles. Because she was so calm, the students thought she was a coward. They thought she was a piece of rag they could step on and grind into the dirt. "Look at her," a girl named Tolu whispered as Ruth walked into the senior secondary class. "She looks like she hasn't eaten in 3 days. Does she even have a husband? Or is she too poor to even buy a mirror to see how miserable she looks?" The class burst into a roar of laughter. The sound was loud and mocking, echoing off the high ceiling of the expensive classroom. Madam Ruth did not say a word. She did not even look up. She simply opened her blue register, her fingers slightly trembling as she picked up a piece of white chalk. She started writing on the chalkboard, the screeching sound of the chalk the only thing fighting against the laughter of the children. Her hand was steady, but inside, her heart was beating like a drum. She knew what was coming. She knew the names of every child laughing. She knew their bed numbers in the hostel. She knew which ones had parents who were billionaires and which ones were just following the crowd. In Lagos, people say that you should be careful of a person who does not talk back when you insult them. They say that such people have a secret place in their soul where they keep their anger, and when that place is finally full, the earth shakes. Madam Ruth's anger was not just a cup, it was a sea, and it was overflowing. "Madam Ruth, your dress is torn at the back. We can see your poverty," another student shouted from the middle row. It was a wicked lie, but the whole class roared again. Some students even stood up on their desks to point at her. Ruth turned around slowly, her eyes meeting the eyes of the students. She didn't look angry. She looked tired, like a woman who had carried a heavy mountain on her back for 1,000 years. "Please, my children, let us focus on the lesson," she said softly. Her voice was like a dry leaf blowing in the wind. "Education is the only thing that will follow you when you leave these big gates." "Education? Who wants to learn from a ghost?" a tall boy in the back yelled, throwing a crumpled piece of paper at her head. It hit her forehead and fell to the floor. Madam Ruth stared at the paper for a long time. She didn't pick it up. She didn't call for order. She just turned back to the board. This was the daily life of Madam Ruth. She was a woman who had come to the city of Lagos with a heart full of hope. She wanted to teach, to help children grow, and to earn enough money to send back to her aging mother in the village. But the children of Green Spring School had turned into wolves. They saw her kindness as a target. They saw her silence as an invitation to be cruel. They didn't know that every night, the ghost they mocked became the hunter. They didn't know that the woman who couldn't even look them in the eye during the day was the same creature that would soon be watching them sleep from the dark corners of their dormitories. As the school bell rang for the end of the day, signaling the time for lunch and afternoon naps, Madam Ruth packed her bags. She walked past the principal's office, a grand room with air conditioning and leather chairs. Outside she saw the big men of Lagos, the parents, dropping off their children in black SUVs with tinted windows. The parents looked proud, shaking hands with the principal, thinking their children were safe behind the high walls and the barbed wire of Green Spring School. They thought their money could buy protection. They didn't know that a boarding school can be the loneliest and most dangerous place in the world when the lights go out and the adults are fast asleep. Madame Ruth reached her small one-room apartment at the very edge of the staff quarters. The room was far away from the others, surrounded by tall grass and a fence that was falling apart. She sat on her thin mattress and waited. She didn't eat. She didn't drink. She just watched the clock on the wall. At 9 p.m., the students were forced to go to bed by the hostel wardens. At 10 p.m., the senior students smuggled in phones and whispered in the dark, laughing about how they would frustrate Madame Ruth the next day. At 11 p.m., the giant generators were turned off to save fuel, and the school was swallowed by a thick, heavy darkness. The only sound left was the chirping of crickets and the distant honking of cars on the Lagos-Ibadan expressway. Then the clock struck 12. The air in the room became cold, so cold that Madame Ruth's breath came out like white mist. Her skin began to itch and burn. She stood up, her eyes turning from brown to a bright glowing yellow that cut through the dark. Her bones began to stretch and snap, making a sound like dry wood breaking. She didn't scream. She had done this many times before. Her legs joined together, smoothing out into a long, powerful tail. Her clothes, the same old dress the students mocked, fell to the floor in a heap. Within minutes, the quiet, poor teacher was gone. In her place was a thick, green python with a head as large as a man's fist. Her scales were as hard as armor and as silent as silk. She didn't need a key to leave her room. She slipped through the small space under the door, her long body flowing like water. She moved toward the hostels, her tongue flickering out to taste the air. She could smell the fear, the sweat, and the arrogance of the sleeping children. She had a list in her mind, a list written in blood, and the first name on that list was a boy named Paul, a boy who thought his father's power made him a god. Madame Ruth slithered past the sleeping security guards. She moved through the shadows of the mango trees, her green body blending perfectly with the leaves. She was no longer the teacher they could spit on. She was the nightmare they had invited into their beds. The sun rose over Green Spring School like any other day, but for Madame Ruth, the light felt like a heavy weight. She was back in her human skin, dressed in her usual faded brown skirt and a blouse that had been ironed so many times the fabric was shining. Her body ached from the night's journey, but her face remained as still as a stone. She walked into the senior secondary 3 classroom, her eyes fixed on the floor. At the back of the class sat Paul. Paul was not just any student. He was the son of Chief Alabi, one of the most powerful politicians in Lagos. Paul did not wear the school uniform like everyone else. He wore custom-made shirts and expensive gold chains that peeked out from his collar. He sat with his legs crossed on top of the mahogany desk, a smirk on his face that said he owned the world and everyone in it. "Madame Ruth is here," Paul announced loudly, not even looking at her. "The woman who smells like old books and failure has arrived." The class giggled nervously. Even the students who felt sorry for Madame Ruth didn't dare to speak up. They knew that Paul's father could shut down the school with one phone call. They knew the principal bowed whenever Paul's father visited. Paul was untouchable. Madame Ruth walked to the front of the class. "Paul, please put your legs down. We are about to start the mathematics lesson." Paul didn't move. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out an expensive lighter and a stick of cigarette. The class went dead silent. This was a boarding school with very strict rules, but Paul didn't care about rules. He flicked the lighter, the flame dancing in the air, and lit the cigarette. He took a long drag and blew a cloud of thick, gray smoke toward the ceiling. "I said I am not in the mood for math," Paul said, his voice dripping with venom. "Why don't you go back to your hut and pray for a better life? My father's monthly allowance for my dogs is more than your salary for a whole year." Madame Ruth felt a heat rising in her chest, a heat that had nothing to be with the Lagos sun. She walked toward Paul's desk, her voice trembling slightly. "Paul, this is a school. You cannot smoke here. It is against the law and it is bad for your health. Give it to me now." Paul stood up slowly. He was much taller than Madame Ruth. He walked straight up to her, his chest almost touching her shoulder. The other students held their breath. Paul took another deep puff of the cigarette, leaned down until his face was inches from hers, and blew the hot, stinging smoke directly into Madame Ruth's eyes. Madame Ruth coughed and covered her face, her eyes watering and turning red. Through the haze, she felt a sharp pain on her shoulder. Paul had reached out and pushed her hard. "Get out of my way, woman. If you ever talk to me like that again, I will call my father and make sure you are sleeping under the bridge by tomorrow morning. You are nothing." He laughed, a loud, ugly sound, and walked out of the classroom, leaving the door swinging. Madame Ruth stood there, the smoke still hanging in her hair, her eyes burning. She didn't report him. She didn't go to the principal's office. She knew the principal would only blame her for upsetting such an important student. She simply picked up her chalk and continued writing on the board, though her hand was shaking so much the numbers looked like broken bones. The day crawled by. During lunch, Paul sat in the cafeteria, bragging to his friends about how he had dealt with the quiet teacher. He ate fried chicken and drank expensive soda, laughing and pointing at Madame Ruth as she walked past the window with a small plastic bowl of rice. He didn't see the way she looked at him. He didn't see the yellow flash in her eyes that lasted only a second. Night fell over Green Spring School. The moon was hidden behind thick, black clouds, making the campus feel like a graveyard. In the boys' hostel, Paul lay on his soft mattress. He was wearing his expensive silk pajamas, his phone glowing in the dark as he messaged his friends about the party he would throw over the weekend. He felt safe. He felt powerful. He felt like a king. At exactly 12 a.m., the air in the hostel became thick and heavy. The air conditioner in the room hummed, but it couldn't stop the sudden chill that swept over the beds. Paul felt a strange sensation, like something cold and smooth was moving under his bed. He ignored it, thinking it was just the wind. But then he heard a sound. It was a soft, wet sound like a rope being dragged over silk. Paul looked over the edge of his bed. In the dim light of his phone screen, he saw something green. It was thick as a man's thigh. It was coiling itself around the legs of his bed, moving upward with a terrifying grace. Paul's heart began to hammer against his ribs. He tried to scream, but his throat felt like it was filled with sand. He saw a head emerge from the darkness. It was a large-headed python, its scales shimmering like polished emeralds. The snake's eyes were not animal eyes. They were yellow, glowing with a deep human intelligence. They were the eyes of Madame Ruth. The snake didn't rush. It slid onto the bed, the weight of its body pressing down on Paul's legs. Paul was paralyzed with fear. He watched as the python reared up, its large head hovering just inches from his face. The snake didn't hiss anymore. It just stared at him, its yellow eyes reflecting the terror in his own. Paul thought of his father. He thought of his money, his cars, and his power. But none of that could help him now. In the dark of the hostel, there was no big man. There was only the hunter and the prey. The python opened its mouth wide, revealing rows of sharp, backward-pointing teeth and a throat that looked like a dark tunnel. It didn't bite him on the arm or the leg. It struck him directly in the throat, right where his arrogant words used to come from. Paul felt a sharp, cold sting, and then a strange heat began to spread through his veins. The snake stayed there for a moment, watching as Paul's eyes began to roll back into his head. Then, as silently as it had arrived, the python slid off the bed, moved across the floor, and disappeared through the narrow gap in the window. By 6 a.m., the hostel was filled with screams. The students had found Paul. He was lying still, his skin pale and cold. There were no marks on his body except for 2 tiny red dots on his neck that looked like a common insect bite. The school doctor was called immediately. The principal was shaking, his face white with fear. He knew he had to explain this to the most powerful politician in the state. After a quick look, the doctor shook his head. "It's a tragedy," the doctor whispered. "It looks like his heart just stopped. Or perhaps he choked in his sleep. Natural cause. Very rare for a boy his age, but it happens." In the distance, the school bell rang for morning assembly. Madam Ruth stood in the line of teachers, her head bowed, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She looked like she hadn't slept at all, but as the news of Paul's death spread through the lines of crying students, a tiny, almost invisible smile touched her lips. The king was gone, and the hunt had only just begun. The death of Paul sent a wave of cold fear through Green Spring School, but in Lagos, life moves fast. While the teachers whispered in corners and the principal shook every time his phone rang, some students were already forgetting the lesson. They thought Paul's death was just bad luck, a heart that stopped too soon. They didn't realize that the school had a silent judge, and she was sitting right in front of them in the classroom. Aminat was the leader of the Golden Girls. She was beautiful, wealthy, and had a tongue that was as sharp as a razor blade. She didn't use her fists like Paul. She used her words to break people. Aminat had 3 best friends who followed her everywhere like shadows. Together, they made sure that anyone they didn't like felt like nothing. A week after Paul's funeral, Madam Ruth was standing at the chalkboard, trying to explain a poem about the beauty of the African sunset. Her voice was thin, and she looked even more tired than before. "The sun sets for everyone, rich or poor," Madam Ruth said, her back to the class. Aminat leaned over to her friends and whispered loudly, "The sun has certainly set on her wardrobe. Look at her heels. One is higher than the other. She walks like a limping goat." The 3 friends erupted into high-pitched giggles. Aminat didn't stop there. As Madam Ruth turned around, Aminat stood up, holding her nose with 2 fingers. "Madam, please," Aminat said with a fake smile. "The smell of palm oil and struggle is too much today. Can you please stay near the window so we can breathe? Some of us use perfumes that cost more than your village house. We don't want to be contaminated by your poverty." The class went, "Ooh." In that way students do when someone has been thoroughly insulted. Madam Ruth stopped writing. She looked at Aminat. For the first time, she didn't look away. She stared deep into Aminat's eyes. "Aminat," Ruth said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Beauty is like a flower. It blooms in the morning, but by evening, it can be stepped on and forgotten. Use your youth to be kind, not to be a queen of thorns." Aminat laughed, a loud, screeching sound that filled the room. "Save your proverbs for your empty cooking pot, madam. You are just jealous because you are old and nobody cares if you disappear tomorrow. Girls, let's go. This class is boring." Aminat and her 3 friends packed their bags in the middle of the lesson and walked out, swaying their hips. As they passed Madam Ruth's desk, Aminat intentionally swept Madam Ruth's only pair of reading glasses onto the floor. Cracks. The glass shattered. Aminat didn't even look back. She just kept laughing as she walked down the hallway. Madam Ruth knelt down to pick up the broken pieces of her glasses. A small piece of glass cut her finger, and a single drop of bright red blood fell onto the white floor. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just sucked the blood from her finger and watched the 4 girls disappear around the corner. That night, she didn't even wait for the clock to strike 12. Her skin was already beginning to itch by 11:30 p.m. In the girls' senior hostel, the air was filled with the smell of expensive lotions and hairspray. Aminat was sitting on her bed, her friends gathered around her. They were eating smuggled chocolate and mocking the way Madam Ruth had looked when her glasses broke. "Did you see her face?" One girl laughed. "She looked like she wanted to cry, but she's too dry to even have tears." "She's pathetic," Aminat said, yawning. "Anyway, I need to use the bathroom. All this laughing has made my bladder full." Aminat stood up and walked down the long, dark corridor toward the hostel bathrooms. The hallway was silent. The only light came from a dim bulb at the very end that flickered like a dying heart. As she pushed open the heavy wooden door of the bathroom, she felt a sudden gush of cold air. Tap was leaking somewhere. Aminat walked toward the last stall. She didn't notice the long, dark shape coiled around the pipes near the ceiling. She didn't see the yellow eyes watching her every move. Just as Aminat reached for the door handle, something dropped from the ceiling with a heavy thud. It landed right in front of her. Aminat froze. Her heart stopped for a second. It was a snake, The biggest snake she had ever seen. Its body was as thick as a palm tree trunk, and its scales were a deep, poisonous green. Aminat tried to turn and run, but the snake was faster. It didn't coil around her. It simply struck. It bit her hard on the ankle, its fangs sinking deep into her soft skin. Aminat let out a short, muffled scream, but the snake's large head rose up, its yellow eyes glowing in the dark, and she felt all the strength leave her body. She fell to the cold tiles, her vision blurring. The python didn't eat her. It just watched her for a moment, flicking its tongue near her ear as if whispering a final proverb. Then, it slithered back into the shadows of the ceiling. The next morning, the girls' hostel was a scene of chaos. Aminat's friends had found her slumped against the bathroom wall. She was burning with a fever so hot it felt like she was on fire. Her eyes were bloodshot, and she was shivering violently. The school nurse arrived, followed by the principal. "She has a very high fever," the nurse said, pressing a damp cloth to Aminat's forehead. "It looks like a very sudden and severe case of malaria or maybe a strange typhoid. But she was fine yesterday." By noon, Aminat was gone. The golden girl of Green Spring School had passed away in the school clinic. The official report sent to her parents said she died of severe cerebral fever. No one checked her ankle for the tiny, hidden puncture marks. No one linked her death to the quiet teacher whose glasses had been broken the day before. Madam Ruth sat in the staff room, wearing a new pair of glasses she had bought with her meager savings. She was grading papers with a red pen. When the announcement of Aminat's death came over the loudspeaker, the other teachers started wailing and praying. Madam Ruth just kept marking. She put a big red X through a blank page in her notebook. The students who remained were now truly terrified. 2 deaths in 2 weeks. The big men children were no longer laughing. They started to look at the walls, the ceilings, and the quiet shadows. They started to wonder, who would be next? The atmosphere at Green Spring School had changed from one of luxury to one of a funeral home. The laughter that used to echo through the hallways was replaced by the sound of frantic prayers and the dragging of suitcases. Parents were arriving in their numbers, demanding to take their children home. But the school management, desperate to save their reputation and the millions of naira in school fees, begged the parents to stay. "It is just a coincidence," the principal told a crowd of angry mothers. "We have fumigated the hostels. We have called the best doctors. It is just a seasonal illness." But the students knew better. They noticed that Madam Ruth had become even more silent, if that was possible. She moved like a shadow through the corridors. Whenever she passed, students would press themselves against the walls, holding their breath until she was gone. They didn't know why they were afraid of her, but their spirits could feel the coldness radiating from her skin. To calm the parents, the school hired 7 notorious security guards, men who were known to be hard. These were not regular guards. They were men who carried heavy flashlights and long, jagged machetes. They were told to patrol the grounds from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. and to kill anything that moved, be it a thief or a beast. "If it's a snake, chop it to pieces," the lead guard said, sharpening his blade under the moonlight. "If it's a spirit, we have charms to bind it." That night, Madam Ruth sat in her room. She could hear the heavy boots of the 7 guards crunching on the gravel outside. She could see the beams of their powerful flashlights sweeping across her window. Her heart was heavy. She didn't want to kill everyone. She only wanted respect. But the school had become a place of war. As the clock struck midnight, the transformation began. This time it was painful. Her anger was so great that the python she became was larger than ever before. Its scales were no longer just green. They were a dark, bruised purple-black. She slipped out of her window and headed toward the senior girls' hostel. She had heard a group of students earlier that day planning to steal her lesson notes and burn them, just to see her cry. But as she slithered through the tall grass, a bright light suddenly blinded her. "Look, over there. In the grass," one guard shouted. "God of mercy, look at the size of it," another cried. The 7 guards surrounded the area. Madam Ruth, in her snake form, froze. She could feel the vibrations of their heavy boots. She saw the flash of steel as they raised their machetes. "Don't let it reach the hostel. Kill it now." The guards moved in. One guard swung his machete, narrowly missing her tail. Madame Ruth realized she couldn't just hide anymore. These men were standing between her and the justice she sought. The python reared up, its head rising 5 feet into the air. The guards gasped. They had never seen a snake this large in Lagos. "Shoot it!" the lead guard yelled, reaching for a locally made pistol. But the snake moved like lightning. It didn't bite. It swung its massive body, knocking 3 guards to the ground. In the confusion, the python lunged. 1, 2, 3 times it struck. Each guard felt a sharp prick, nothing more. They thought they were winning. They kept swinging their blades, cutting the air, as the snake slithered into the dark drain pipes and vanished. "It escaped," the guards shouted, panting. "But we scared it off. It won't come back." They stood together, boasting about their bravery. But within 10 minutes, the first guard began to complain that his tongue felt too big for his mouth. The second guard fell to his knees, clutching his chest. By 2 a.m., all 7 guards were lying in the grass, their flashlights still shining into the empty sky. In the morning, the school was a scene of horror. 7 grown men dead. No blood, no struggle. Just 7 bodies with the same natural look of heart failure. The news hit Lagos like a bomb. "The cursed school," the newspapers shouted. The parents didn't wait for the principal's permission anymore. They broke down the gates. They carried their children and ran. Madame Ruth stood at the balcony of the staff quarters, watching the chaos. She saw the expensive cars racing away, throwing dust into the air. She saw the teachers packing their bags in a panic. The school was dying, and for the first time in years, Madame Ruth felt a sense of peace. But as she turned to go into her room to pack her own things, she saw the principal standing there. He looked like he had aged 20 years. He was holding a file, her file. "Ruth," he whispered, his voice shaking. "I looked at the records. Every time a student was mean to you, they died the next day. Even the guards. I saw you talking to them yesterday." Madame Ruth didn't move. She looked at the principal, her yellow eyes flashing for just a split second. "I told you they should be kind, sir. I told you this school needed discipline. You didn't listen." The principal backed away, his hands trembling. You are not human." "I am what this school made me," she replied softly. By sunset, Green Spring School was empty. The big gates were chained shut. The flowers began to wither. The peace that the school finally found was the peace of a graveyard. The sun no longer shone brightly on Green Spring School. The once beautiful white walls were now covered in dust and peeling paint. The expensive cars were gone, leaving only the deep tracks of their tires in the dried mud. The Lagos state government had officially closed the school, declaring it a place of unexplained tragedy. All the teachers, the cooks, and the cleaners were dismissed. Some left crying, but most left running, afraid that the curse of the school would follow them home. Madame Ruth was the last person to leave. She carried only one small suitcase. Inside were her textbooks, her broken reading glasses, and a small photo of her mother. As she walked toward the giant iron gates, she didn't look back at the empty hostels or the silent classrooms. She looked at the horizon where the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. She vanished into the busy streets of Lagos, becoming just another face in the crowd. No one knew her name. No one knew her secret. She was just a quiet woman in a faded dress, moving through the world like a ghost. A year passed. A new management team bought the property. They changed the name from Green Spring School to New Horizon Academy. They repainted the walls a bright, cheerful blue. They brought in new teachers from outside the country and installed hundreds of security cameras in every corner, the hostels, the bathrooms, and even the staff quarters. The new principal was a man who believed in kindness above everything else. On the first day of school, he gathered all the new students in the assembly hall. "In this school," he said, his voice echoing in the clean hall. "We do not care how much money your father has. We do not care if you are the son of a king or the daughter of a billionaire. Here we respect the person who cleans the floor as much as we respect the person who teaches the class. Here we know that every person carries a power you cannot see." The school finally found peace. There were no more midnight deaths. There were no more natural fevers. But the legend of the Green Python of Green Spring School stayed behind. The older students who had survived whispered the story to the newcomers. They told them about the quiet teacher who never talked back. They told them about Paul and Aminat. The story became a lesson that every student carried in their heart. They learned that your tongue can be a weapon, but it can also be your downfall. They learned that being a big man in the daytime does not protect you from the shadows of the night. But there was one more lesson, a deeper one for the parents. Many of the parents who had sent their children to the old school realized too late that they had failed. They had thought that by paying millions of naira, they could outsource the character of their children. They thought a boarding school was a place to dump their kids so they could focus on their businesses and politics. They forgot that a child who is not taught respect at home will be taught a much harder lesson by the world outside. One evening, a young boy at the new school was about to shout at a junior student who had accidentally stepped on his shoe. He opened his mouth to insult the boy's parents, but then he stopped. He looked at the dark corner of the ceiling. He remembered the story of the large-headed python. He closed his mouth, took a deep breath and smiled. "It's okay," the boy said softly. "Just be careful next time." Far away, in a small village hidden deep in the countryside, an old woman sat on a porch, watching the moon rise. Beside her sat a younger woman, peeling oranges with a small knife. The younger woman looked calm, her eyes soft and brown. Suddenly, a group of local children ran past, shouting and playing. One of the boys tripped and fell, accidentally splashing dirty water on the younger woman's dress. The boy froze, his eyes wide with fear, waiting for the woman to scream or beat him. The woman looked at the wet patch on her dress. She looked at the trembling boy. She didn't get angry. She didn't transform. She simply reached into her pocket, pulled out a small piece of candy, and handed it to him. "Go and play, my son," Madam Ruth said with a gentle smile. "But always remember to watch where you are stepping. You never know what might be hiding in the grass." The boy thanked her and ran off laughing. Madam Ruth watched him go, then turned her gaze back to the moon. She was no longer a hunter. She was no longer a victim. She was at peace. But the green scales were still there, just beneath the surface, waiting for the next time the world forgot to be kind.